we have entered the age of de-bossification. These people are not refusing to come back to the office. They're refusing to come back to be under my control, my monitoring, my allocating. And instead, I need to think about not being a boss, but a leader. That as a leader, I need to be a mentor, a guide, a creator. In effect, what it is easier to force people back into the office than to reinvent yourself.
Welcome to The Future of Less Work, the podcast that's uncovering how work is changing one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today I have a really special guest. Rishad Tobaccowala is a leading voice in the conversations shaping the new world of work. His thought letter, The Future Does Not Fit into the Current Containers of the Past, is a must-read for me every Sunday. And his latest book, Rethinking Work, is a wonderful new addition to exactly that, Rethinking Work. I had the honor of reading the book and sharing my thoughts in a recommendation that now appears in the official website. So I'm thrilled to host Rishad in person on the Future of Less Work podcast today. Hello.
Hello, Nirit. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your contributions and help on my book.
Oh, I am thrilled and honored. You know, I have a question for you that starts with your own career. You actually came up through marketing. You spent decades, right, shaping strategy and growth in one of the world's largest advertising firms. How did your journey take you here to the future of work and being such a dominant voice in this journey?
Well, I would say that there were two or three reasons. So, yes, I grew up in India, got a math degree, got an MBA from the University of Chicago, and started working at what was the Leo Burnett agency. And I spent my entire 37-year career either at Leo Burnett or the company that acquired us, which is the big Publicis Group, which is now 106,000 people globally. But in that particular process of 37 years, in addition to being working in the advertising and marketing space, I also got to both work around the world, but also launch new types of companies of different shapes and sizes. So I was the chairman of a 10,000 person group of companies. And I also 3 times started a company with one other person inside the company and built it to about 100, 150 people each time. And I began to, sort of get interested in the topic then. But what was the real impetus was 5.5 years ago, I left that career. And from being a career where I was working at that time, 86,000 people, I became a company of one. So I was an individual. And that was 6 months or 7 months before COVID. So for 7 months, I was working by myself at home. And then COVID happened and everybody was working at home. And I began to recognize that the 7 months before COVID, that everybody else was working, pretending that they were in 2019, but the technology was 2002. And
So
I was
your
in
own
20.
experience that you were working from home, but you felt that
Yeah,
you were not alone, although
I was not alone. But in 2019, that 6 months of
yes, yes.
2019, I was at home and I was using technology that was more sophisticated than the people in the office. And when they would say you're remote, I said, I feel very connected. Why do you think that the center of the universe is the office? And if you're not in the office, you're remote. It could be something different. And then COVID happened. And then I took a look at all my experiences and I began to say, people are not actually, everybody eventually also wants to go back to where it was in 2019, but we were doing it all wrong in 2019. And COVID accelerated and opened our minds to what was actually happening. So that's how I
You know,
started writing about the subject.
so it's one of those conversations that I think begs the question: can you do this because you've had all those years of office experience and because you've had the opportunity to build those in-person connections, and therefore you could build on those? But what would happen if we fast forwarded a number of years And, we age those connections and we lose touch, and suddenly we're really alone.
Yes. So I do believe in the importance of in-person connections. But what I do not believe is those necessarily have to take place in the office. So my belief is the question is not to ask, how do we get people back into the office? The question is, how do we maximize the benefits of in-person interaction while providing people with freedom and providing a company with agility and cost effectiveness in hiring and retaining and attracting talent? If you frame a question like that, you come differently. So I completely believe in in-person interaction. Last year, I'm a company of one. I flew 95 times. So if I didn't believe in
Wow.
in-person interaction, I would have basically done it without it. But I also remind people that those 95 times, I rarely visited the same person more than 2 times in a year. And I manage a relationship with that person the rest of the time virtually. So my belief is, yes, you need some in-person interaction to create, in certain circumstances, but there's this very famous line, familiarity breeds contempt. Do you need to actually see somebody every single day to make a relationship happen? I mean, it may
Yeah.
be true when it's a husband or wife, but it's not true in the world of business. And so
Yeah.
my whole stuff is you have
Of
a,
us, so,
yeah,
those of us working globally, right? We
yeah,
know this, right? So I
yeah,
spent almost 3 decades at Intel, more than a decade in global roles, right? And so I did not see the people I managed. If I was lucky, I would see them 4 times a year. And as a group, I probably didn't even do that, right? So you learn to build relationships and trust. And what you're seeing is actually, you can hear it. So leaders who have moved beyond return to office are actually saying the same things. They say people need to
yes,
meet, but the office doesn't
yes,
necessarily, have to be that place. The reason I'm pushing back on this for you is because we really have to help think through the difficulty, the valid questions, right, that are raised by leaders who are
yes,
saying, I don't know how to lead an organization this way. And why does it make
yes.
sense for me to fly people all over the world, right? Then simply to just say, here's a building, step into it, number of times, choose your iteration. What do you tell them?
Well, so I would first of all say, as you have seen in my book sets up frameworks and ways to think. It's not a screed. So I don't have like, there is a way, right? So I said, figure out certain things and decide what makes sense for you. So this is what I basically tell them. One is you need to think about what you do with where people are based on the title, the experience, the job that needs to be done. So, for instance, to your point, if someone was to join a company, like my new company, I would insist that for the first 3 to 6 months, they come together at some location almost every day of the week. Because during that time, it would be like boot camp. They would get to know each other, they would get trained, they would be familiarized with other people. On the other hand, someone like you and me with a lot of expertise who aren't necessarily managing a lot of people could basically work pretty much anywhere at any time. So there's a range. And
Yeah.
what I
So
find
you're saying,
incredible,
almost one of the rules of the future of the kind of new world of work is
right?
personalized.
So,
There isn't a
yeah,
one
so
size fits
exactly.
all.
Right. So what basically happens is the first thing I would basically say is every company talks about personalization, but refuses to personalize the workspace.
Yeah.
Okay. So my whole stuff is that's number one. Number two is there is significant data that basically shows that in most cases, what you basically have found is that distributed work has not significantly reduced productivity. In fact, it has increased it. And distributed work has made people, in many cases, actually happier, particularly those who are of middle age, who are bringing up families or looking after aging parents. So, in effect, again, look at the data and then personalize around the data, which is number one. The other one is what I would also tell them is if you were to start a company today, would you buy expensive real estate in a city, force human people to move their body parts 1 to 2 hours a day to come into this particular location, put on headphones, look at screens, and go back, which is exactly what is happening right now.
So why do you think smart managers who know how to read the systems, who understand the trends, right? I mean, I refuse to buy that they don't, right? Why are they pushing us back to the
They're
future?
pushing us back for a couple of reasons, both very valid, but once I explain what they are to them, they begin to realize maybe they should be thinking it slightly differently. The number one is the fear of the unknown, which is I'm used to doing certain things in certain ways, and this is new. And therefore, change is always difficult, as I've written. But the second is a we voice that basically says, we have entered the age of de-bossification. These people are not refusing to come back to the office. They're refusing to come back to be under my control, my monitoring, my allocating. And instead, I need to think about not being a boss, but a leader. And as a leader, I need to be a mentor, a guide, a creator. And
Yeah.
in effect, what it is easier to force people back into the office than to reinvent yourself.
Yeah, I think the essence of this, and this is why it's so important, is people are saying, okay, we have to go back because we can't figure out how to build engagement this way. We can't figure out how to build culture this way. And so let's go back to the way we know, right? And what you're saying, and I've been saying, and I know other people as well, is
Yeah,
we have to figure out how to do all these things in the new environment because that's not going away.
that is not going away. Exactly.
And I think we
And
need to talk about the why. And I'm probably going to take you right back to the beginning of your book, right?
yeah,
Because you can't go back to the future. And the reason what brought us here is not going to take us forward is because we're seeing some significant seismic shifts, right? You talk
yes.
about what those are.
Yeah. So what tends to basically happen is there are five seismic shifts, which are obviously interrelated. So I try to tease them apart, but they're interrelated. The first one are just social changes, and those can be declining population. So outside of 7 countries in the world, in the United, and so 7 countries outside of those, the population is declining. That's number one. Number two, outside of Africa, in almost every other country, the populations are aging really fast. So that's one demographic change. Second is because people need to work longer, you have often 4 and sometimes even 5 generations at work with very different mindsets and life experiences. So if you basically think about those, you also think about increased disengagement at work that has been increasing. Gallup yesterday published
Yes.
for this is US, and they said engagement at work is now at a 10-year low at 31%, and active disengagement is at an all-time high of 17%. Okay. So you have these shifts, which basically say the current model is not working, and all these other things with aging populations, declining populations is one. Second, obviously, is technology, and I broadly describe it not just as AI, but blockchain and a whole bunch of other things. Third is the rise of marketplaces. So those are things like you and I can plug into Amazon Web Services. You created a whole bunch of things at Intel. If you've got a side hustle or side gig, you can go to Etsy or Shopify or things like that. That's the third. Fourth is the rise of the gig worker. One, because technology allows it. Second, people need additional income, or they may have passions, or they may want to have just optionality in their lives. And then the last one is actually the impact of COVID, not as much on where you work, but what you think about work. So what happened is a lot of people for 2.5 years were sitting at home, seeing people die around them and operating at home without having their bosses oversee them. And they started to ask, why are we doing things the way we are? And the big question became not, how do I fit life into my work, but how do I fit work into my life? And so
Right,
it's a
right.
mindset change rather than a place change. So even people, when they're solving for COVID, they're solving for the wrong thing, which is space.
Yes.
Well, and it's versus it's mindset. And so if you take those five, and obviously they're interrelated, technology plays a role, marketplace, all of that. But those five are the five seismic changes. And almost every senior manager who I've shared these five with comes away saying, I haven't been thinking about this correctly. You just proved to me that this isn't just about COVID and about this is that I can wish away this. This is like true.
So I have to share with you because
Yeah.
these are the conversations that are happening in boardrooms these days, right? So I have been having this conversation with just the last week with two CEOs, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I called this podcast "The Future of Less Work," and what I mean by that is that there are all these trends coming together that are either enabling people to work less because they might want to fit other things into their life, which is that kind of different social contract of what success means. But it's also there's a lot of technology coming in that might take away some of what we work, and then the question is, are we going to just work more, and fill up the gap, or are we not, right? And so I think there's a lot of change here, both from technology and from the social contracts of around work. And I actually interpret it the way you do, and I say to people, COVID woke us up to the fact that life is short, and every day we go to work is the day of our life we trade, and we want that trade to be worth it. And we also started realizing, because during a lot of times you don't fulfill dreams because there's too much risk, right? But COVID had you sitting at home. There was no price to pay on maybe opening that eBay store that you have always wanted or something like that. And then came the gig economy. And so, you might be maybe a supermarket manager, and you're saying, okay, but my cashier can't work remotely. Well, it doesn't matter if she can work remotely in your supermarket. The question is, does she have alternatives that give her the ability to build more flexibility into her life? And so suddenly this gig economy becomes, a marketplace for you. So when you look at all this, the way I see it, and I think you're saying the same thing, is you have to think differently about how you build the economic structure of whatever it is your organization is trying to do, and worry about what you're trying to deliver, and less about kind of those pieces that the office, the employee. Here's what they're telling me, right? But they're pushing back, and I want your perspective on that. What they're telling me is somebody just a CEO just told me this a week ago. You've got this wrong, he said. She said there's meritocracy, that the people, if I have a 10-person marketing group and 3 will learn how to use AI, and I will be able to let the 7 go, those 3 will do, what the 10 did. They'll be compensated for it. And that's how I'll move forward. And I said, no, actually, I don't think they're going to give you that. I think they're going to want to take some of that productivity back.
Yeah. So I first of all basically believe that I completely agree with you. The going in mindset is people basically believe that they control and manage us by our inputs versus our outputs, right? So someone I talked to this very, very wealthy gentleman at lunch the other day, and he said when he was growing up, someone told him, your issue is that you think solving things is working harder when actually solving things is working smarter, right? And so the whole idea is you don't measure things by input, you measure things by outcome or output. And what tends to basically happen is if my productivity, because of AI, increases twofold, I am not going to basically hand over that surplus to somebody who says, we'll give you a 20% raise because you're more productive. I'm
Yeah.
actually going to say, I need at least 80% of that to be me. And other 20% is because you're taking some of the risk.
I
That's number
agree,
one.
but how do you convince the managers that that's right?
Well, the way to convince the managers is very simply this. I basically ask them to have a drink or two and do the following two exercises. So, exercise number one is imagine they were starting their company today with nothing but a blank sheet of paper and having to satisfy and win against their customer or whoever their competitors are. How would they create the company? And not a single person creates it the way they currently run the company. Okay? Because they realize that their competitor who starts today doesn't have any of those legacy costs. But my whole basic belief is no one is starting that way. So, and in today's world with transformational technology like AI, who would start that way? No one would.
Yeah.
So why would you continue that way? That's number one. Number two is forget about the fact that you are a boss. Think of yourself as a highly talented person. If you're a highly talented person, how would you run your career now for the next 5 years or 6 years? And would you work for somebody who takes all the surplus? Would you work for somebody, even though you're world class, who says you have to do it this way and you're ever going to come back? Or will you look around for choices? And if you're as good as you claim you are, don't you think there will be choices? And so, in effect, what will basically happen is for the same person who says meritocracy, I basically say meritocracy basically doesn't mean that you give powerful people or very successful people more money. It means they have more options.
Yes, I actually totally agree with you. I think that that was kind of where our conversation
Yeah,
went. Um, I think that depends on, though, if you believe there's a talent shortage, right? Which is another
right.
piece of it. Because
Which is another piece.
technically speaking, if there isn't a talent shortage, then um,
Right.
it's not a problem to hold
Yeah.
on to
So,
those
so, uh,
people.
so my underlying basic belief, and obviously this is different in different countries, but I'll just focus on some of the Western countries, in the US, and where all the GDP and economy is. So China does not have a problem because they've got 25% unemployment with young people. So that's a different issue. But today, the US economy continues to run hot. Okay. There are some sectors like technology where it's harder to get a job. That is not true in every sector, which is number one. But as importantly, let us just consider the balance of power. So, my underlying basic belief is the balance of power is moving to talent versus management. Okay. Talent versus capital. Now, and I'm saying talent, I'm not saying lower level executives. I'm saying talent, wherever that talent is. Because I also believe, and I've read your stuff, which convinced me that in many ways technology is like a slingshot that allows David to bring down Goliath. Okay,
And yeah, and if we're
and if
democratizing a lot of these skills, it's no
this
longer the
this right, and this
expensive capital of the
yeah,
owner.
right. So my whole basic belief is for $80 a month, I have better access to AI than almost any global company for two simple reasons. One is they usually select one partner. So they go with either a Google or a Microsoft or an Anthropic or OpenAI, etc. I pay for all four because I can afford the $80 as they can. But more importantly, because they have to be safe, they sandbox it. So most people are using 6 months ago technology, which is usually half as good as the technology I'm using, right? So for $80 a month, I have better technology from more sources. And so in effect, I don't need that much capital. Yes, I would need capital if I want to compete with NVIDIA or Taiwan Semiconductor, but I don't need that much capital. So guess what else happens? If I'm highly talented and technology allows me to be like a slingshot, it basically makes me even more productive. And as a result, I would basically say, you don't call the shots anymore. I do. So the reality of it is that is what's really worrying these people because they only know how to be bosses. They don't know
Yeah.
how to be mentors, leaders, and guides. So eventually, this is basically a inability of leadership to reimagine work and themselves. And they're making all these other excuses. And my whole stuff is in today's competitive world of more competition, new companies, technology, and talent, you are dreaming if you think you can go back. And this is what I have two examples or two analogies. It says, when the animals have left the zoo, you're not going to get them back. especially with rancid meat. They're not coming back. So that's number one. Number two is our minds are like champagne corks.
Yeah,
Once
you
it
have.
comes
I
out of
have
the
that
bottle,
quote here. I have that
right?
quote here from your
Once it
book,
comes
right?
out of the bottle, it swells. You can't put it back again. And I said, think about it from your perspective. You have changed as a leader, but you pretend everything else is static.
Yeah, and also I think that the essence of it, and we're seeing the unbundling of work for a really long time, right? And so the ownership model, right? You are my employee. I own your time. Therefore, if you're more productive, I own filling up, giving you assignments in all the other pieces of time. And that worked in the days where you helped me be more productive because you gave me capital, because you gave me training. Now, like you say, I pay my own, 20, 40, 60, $80. And oh, by the way, you're also, you're teaching yourself because you're doing it because you realize it's on you to
It's
stay
it's on
relevant
me.
in the
So
market.
yeah. So as you know, in my writing, I say three things. One is it's a very famous song by Carrie Underwood. When I talk to people, it says, "Jesus, take the wheel." And I said, no, for your career, you should take the wheel, right?
Yes.
Not HR, not anybody else. That's number one. Number two, which is very important, is the world's biggest education platform is called YouTube. And outside of a couple of countries, it's available to everybody. So my whole basic belief is learning can be free as long as you have a YouTube, account. Uh, and to a great extent, what we're beginning to basically see is every sign and every signal, again, outside of very heavy, capital intensive things, which still exist, pharmaceuticals,
Yes.
semiconductor manufacturing, there's more and more, it's the individual. So I've written this thing called We All Need to Operate as Companies of One.
Yes.
Okay, I have a series. I'm not saying you are a company of one. Today, you and I might be companies of one. But even when I was in a big company, I operated like a company of one. And as a company of one, how do I make sure I don't become obsolete? So I have to constantly learn. How do I make sure that I'm in demand? I got to build relationships, right?
Right.
How do I make sure I understand what's going on? I've got to have empathy. So company of one is not some isolated person sitting in a room.
Yes.
It's very different.
Plus, all the technology we talked about allows you to do the network. I mean, you and I met over a network, right?
Exactly allows us to do that. And as I always remind people, the big thing that happened in 2019, I mean, in 2020, 2021, is the entire world stopped and started working in a different way.
Yes.
And that experiment would never have been possible if it was not for COVID, because
Yes.
everybody went virtual 100% of the time. You couldn't do that, you couldn't, as a company, go virtual with everybody else being non-virtual, right?
Yes,
But now everybody
yes,
went
and
virtual.
plus we in organizations, right? Managers or leaders, frankly, are used to being the ones who call the shots, right? So if you want to try an experiment, you create a pilot, and you run it, and you make decisions. And COVID took that decision away from leaders, and that's why it's part of that kind of okay. I'm not ready for this, and I want to take it back to where I'm comfortable. But I want to take you as we talk about this unbundling, right? You talk about the fractionalized employee, and I have to tell you, I wrote about the fractionalized employee over a decade ago, and people didn't even know what the word meant. And today, you go on LinkedIn, and people write, "I'm a fractional CMO, I'm a fractional HR," and I'm thinking,
Yes,
"Wow!"
yes,
Right?
yes, yes, exactly. And so what basically happens is fractional is a big part of the future. And the only difference between today, many of the fractional CMOs and fractional, etc., are a little bit different than my idea for a company to have fractionalized employees. And in some ways, they're similar, but then there's slight enhancements or additions. So usually, most of the fractionalized CMOs or fractionalized CFOs are self-employed, right? And are working for other companies as a freelancer slash contract employee. And that's what like I might do if I wanted. That's one way. But the other one is companies have employees, and today they look at employees either as full-time employees or they're freelancers or they're contract employees. But instead, because of three things, one is aging and declining populations. So you may want to keep some of your more senior or seasoned people on longer, right? So why and there's a huge, it's true in the US, it's not necessarily true in other countries. There's a huge need for healthcare. So, and one of the disadvantages of being a company of one is you have to
If you
struggle
don't
in
get,
decent
yeah,
places
you
like the
don't
US
get
healthcare.
the benefits.
So
In general, I think a lot of
you get
countries,
benefit.
the benefits are different.
Right. So
The
what you
social
basically do it,
security, the social
social
safety
security
net.
is different. So, but like in a
Yeah.
country like the US, the reality of it is if I knew that I could work for a company, I
Yeah.
was an employee of the company, I had equity in the company, I had full 100% healthcare, everything else was prorated. So, I'm going to work 60% of the time for the next year, either because I'm looking after a child, looking after an aging parent, then in effect, or I'm evolving out. So when I started evolving out of publicist, I went to 50% of my time before I went to zero. It was good for the company, it was good for me. Uh, and so what basically happens is and I have equity in the company, I have bonus in the company. It's just that I have healthcare. So I have loyalty, right, to the company. But what are the benefits for the company? The benefits, so I can see benefits for me. What are the benefits of the company? The benefits of the company are threefold. One is they can attract and retain people who they normally would not be able to. Because someone says, you're making me make a choice between looking after my aging parents and work. I can't do that. That's number one. Or you can retain seasoned employees like me. So that's one. The second one is I believe because of AI, most companies, and this is very much with your podcast, right, will require less actual hours and work from people for the same productivity. So it will be a world of less work.
So
And instead,
you're going to start paying for output versus
you
paying
got to
for
pay for
hours.
output. Right. But the other thing you're going to require is there are two ways of deciding that you need 20% fewer employees. Okay. One is eliminating 20% of the employees. But in that particular world, two things happen. You might actually need some of those employees because each one has a unique skill set. Only 5% might be non-performing, right? So you're losing 15% of expertise because you have to make a 20% cut. That's number one. Second, when you do that, what you also basically do is you impact the 80% that's left because they don't like being in a company that lost 20% of the people. They feel guilty. Some of their friends have left. The morale of the place goes down. So instead, what you basically
And
say,
also, Rishad, if I go with what you said in the
yeah,
beginning, right? If you were to start a company today,
yeah,
why would you hire 10 full-time people? And
you wouldn't.
sometimes there's a good answer, but at least
Yeah,
you'd
but in
ask
most cases,
yourself.
you wouldn't. Yeah, you
Exactly.
wouldn't.
And
So
so,
it's so
so, so to me, the fact that we see fractional employees or fractional kind of people positioning themselves as LinkedIn as, take me, I'm a fractional CMO. To me, that's, those are trends that are driven because people are saying, I want to work this way, right? I want
yes,
to put
I want to
together
exactly. I want to work.
my full time in a different way, maybe not work full time, maybe, spend some time learning something new. And companies have yet to learn how to use that because we still operate in the ownership model. You're either mine, or you're not.
Exactly. And what basically happens is eventually the way building on what I basically said, I often say, look, I will come and talk to you. I'm not going to have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to try to give you four things. I'm going to give you some perspectives on how to change your perspective. I'm going to give you a provocation, which might change your perspective. I'm going to give you some points of view, which may or may not make sense. And I'm going to give you potential plans of action. You then decide if any of these make sense. So one of my provocations is we are starting from the basis that we work in an existing company 5 days a week with full-time employees. What if we started with, I'm about to launch a company today, right? Do I need full-time? How many people do I need as full-time employees? You might basically say, I need half my company to be full-time employees and have to be a combination of contract, freelance, fractionalized employment. That's number one. Number two is who and how many people do I need in an office and how many offices do I need? Okay. So once you start that way, so my whole basic belief is we are thinking about how to prune an old tree to find, okay, in it a sailboat. Why don't we basically start with building a sailboat and see how much of the tree we need to use?
Yeah, because we
Okay.
have the old tree already. That's part of what makes it so
Right.
difficult. And I
But
think this is
but
where
my basic sense is when you're solving for the tree, what you're solving for is the past, and your competitors are not solving for the past. Maybe
exactly, and
you're
that's where
right.
Darwinism comes, right? I mean, that's my answer: is if you won't figure this out, somebody else will, and they'll make you obsolete.
I'll give you a very simple example. Like among the many things that I do in my company of one, like is you write, you podcast, I write, I podcast. We advise people, right? We speak at events, whatever we do. So when I do the speaking thing, and depending on who I'm speaking and where I'm speaking, people find it really interesting that I'm very both flexible on my pricing, right? But even when I price at full, I tend to be 25 to 30% less than other people of the same supposed
Okay,
caliber or
and
stature, right?
explain to me kind of what's the logic behind that.
And the logic behind that is the following: the other people have built around them a significant cost structure, right? So many of them say we cannot do without a executive assistant, a scheduler, and a speaking bureau.
Hmm.
And my basic belief is a speaking bureau. I'm represented by speaking bureau, but I don't have to get my business from speaking bureau. I can get my business myself. Speaking bureau takes up to 30% of my revenue. I don't lose that 30%. So I get the same revenue as someone who's priced at 30% higher, right? But so in effect, I can undercut. So this is Darwinian because I'm starting from scratch. I don't have any of that. So my whole stuff is I don't need an office. I don't need any of this stuff. I don't compete on price. But my whole basic belief is if you tell people like I'm in the same caliber, here's my background, here's what I've done, but I'm charging you a third less, right? And it's not because I'm not good. It's because I don't have the cost structure. I'm still getting the same amount of money, right? I don't have to have any of that. Uh, like people say, like, who books your travel? I said, I do. In today's world, I don't need to have a travel agent, right? Or I outsource it to the people who are calling me to speak and say, you do it, and I just come, right? Which is a different thing. So in every case, I tell people, if you're going to compete with today's technology, with today's marketplace, you will think about it very differently. And and as a result, you know, like I just updated my LinkedIn profile. And if you go look at the LinkedIn profile, it looks like I'm running multiple companies, doing multiple things all over the world. And people ask me, how many people do I have? And I say, on my employment, Rishad Tobaccowala LLC is one person. I work with other people. Like when I need to basically design my new Rethinking Work website, I have a world-class designer. He's not on my payroll. I pay him to do that,
Yeah, yeah, that's
right?
what I call networks, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
have a lot of people I interact with, and frankly, they're all either fractional or it's like we're giving each other portions of services.
Yeah. So we're living in this connected age, and that's what makes
Right,
the
right,
difference.
and the economics show that that's happening, right? Because we see
Exactly.
growth and we don't see job growth at the same rate, and so people are
Yes.
finding each other and exchanging work for value in different ways. So we can go on forever. I'm going to
Right.
I'm going to ask you. You say in your book, adapting to change is no longer optional; it's survival, right? So, what's that one piece of advice you'd give leaders that are understand they need to be preparing for a totally different world?
So the piece of advice I give them, besides reading people like you, me, and other people, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to in fact ask you too. On my website, I'm going to have these resources. So I'm going to say, you're a great people who think about the subject. Go talk to them. So one of the key things is um, educate yourself about building the exact opposite of what you believe. So I go out of my way to try to make a case for 5 days a work, full-time employment, all of that stuff, right? Because my whole stuff is, how do I know if I'm right? But by understanding the other perspective, I began to realize, hey, in-person interaction is important and the office isn't, right? It's those kinds of things. So go out of your way, sort of like a growth mindset, to build a case for the exact opposite. And once you've done that, you will come to what is right for you and your company. So I'm not even telling them this is the way, this is one thing. The only one thing would just imagine the opposite, just start from 180 degrees away, right? And work your way back. So
Yes.
that's sort of one way of
Which is
basically
really
doing it,
critical thinking, right? It's like,
which is critical thing. And to help you along, you know, yes, in her book, and there's a, I put, here's what McKinsey says, here's what BC. So I'm going to put all of those things on my site. These are different people, these are different podcasts you can go listen to. They're not mine. I'm just pointing there. You go there. But I said you should educate yourself like you do in every other field of what you do about this, because just like you educate yourself on your industry and your competitive set, you got to educate yourself about this. So that's my one piece of advice.
that's, it's like you said, it's like the core of who you are today. You can't just keep doing what you're doing. Somebody told me it's the things you don't even know that you know. It's like you work on autopilot. You can't do that anymore. You have
E-
to
e-
you have to think
exactly.
new, instead of kind of benchmarks the way we always did it. You have to just like, what's the new way that I need to
Exactly. And
evolve?
then the other thing that you've seen in the book, which you both also have written a lot about, is how at some particular stage I explained that because work is so central, because I've always basically believed that there are three things that drive happiness. Okay. Um, Physical and mental health. It's hard, if you don't have that. Quality of relationships, to be both personal or other relationships. And the third is meaningful, satisfying work. Okay. Those are the three. Now, if you have meaningful, satisfying work, you're likely to live longer, okay, which is there's a direct relationship. You're less likely to go and kick the dog at home. Okay, meaningful work actually feeds also these other two things, if in a
Yeah,
big way.
absolutely.
Okay, and based on what you've written and what I've been saying recently, work will change more between 2019 and 2029 than it has in the last 50 years. If work is so central and work is going to change dramatically, you should pay attention. But the big angle that I've also taken is, as you've seen the last 5 chapters of my book, I speak to different parts of the business. So usually when you think about the future of work, people say, okay, this is a talent and HR issue, right? And one of my whole stuff is, no, you have to change corporate strategy. Where it says reimagine the company with modern strategy. Another is you have to change the way you measure your financials. I talk to CFOs, right? You have to change your organizational design, because in a world of networks and permeable people and cloud services, why are you designed like this, right?
Yeah,
So
the way I was, senior human resources for so many years, and sometimes you couldn't bring in these innovations because, internal freelancing economy or fractional people or part time, because the way the finance system worked, right? So
yeah,
it's like you have the way you measured headcount, you couldn't. It
you you
wasn't.
you
It
you
didn't
you, you,
work.
you couldn't you couldn't do that. And my whole thing is, I say, hey, listen, Delta makes more money selling frequent flyer miles than flying airplanes.
Hmm.
Okay, so they had to change their financials to understand that. And so, similarly, in this new world of work, you have to, just like from analog to digital, in analog, you had one ways of measuring stuff, and digital, you were measuring. In this new world of work, it's going to change all your measurements, your costs, your productivity measurement. And those are things, once people realize that, it becomes very central. But very much like your writing and my writing, we try to illuminate, provide insights, and inspire. We don't provide a screed. So I say, like, I cannot tell you how to run your company. I can just provide you with some perspectives that might help you run it better.
That's fabulous, and that leads me kind of to the question that I always use when I end an episode, and we're really so used to asking for answers. So what I
Yep.
actually want to ask you for is, what is the one question you think we should all be asking ourselves these days about the future of work?
I would basically say the question is, what if we could begin again? Okay. And my whole thing is, start with a blank sheet of paper and say, I've got every asset and resource that I currently have. I have all my assets and resources, but I have no constraints about what I'm going to do in the future, excepting three. Whatever I has to do has to be legal. Whatever I have to do has to be scientifically possible today. And whatever I have to do has to make financial sense in X number of months, and X cannot be greater than 36 and shouldn't be shorter than maybe 3 or 6, right? What would I do? So those are the only constraints you have. You have all your assets, but you have no constraints. Okay?
Yeah, no
And
boxes.
those
You
are,
don't need to fit into the boxes.
you have no boxes. And when people do that, they come up with amazing things. And I said, then why don't you do that? Because if you don't, somebody else will.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Thank you, Rishad, for joining me today. You really have a unique voice. It's so valuable for piecing together the puzzle of the future of work. You'll find all the links to Rishad's thought letter, latest book in the podcast description, along with a recap of today's episode. Thank you for listening to The Future of Less Work. And remember, the new social contract is a win-win between people and organizations. Your best people don't work because they have to. They don't work because you tell them to. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they achieve their own purpose in life. Until next time.